Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, July 20th, 2022. And today, I've got some bad news, unfortunately, and a little bit of an I told you so. Yet another poorly crafted local Second Amendment sanctuary, so-called sanctuary ordinance, is doing exactly what I predicted it would do. Absolutely nothing. So on this episode, I'm going to start out with a few points of what makes for a good Second Amendment sanctuary. Then I got the bad news coming from a state court, or one of the state court system in Oregon. And then I've got some suggestions on how to avoid this problem going forward. If you are doing activism or legislation or whatever it may be on a local level, you want to avoid the pitfalls that we're learning, certainly do not work. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat and a thank you for being here, whether you're watching live or in the archive, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough for being here. Over on the chat, there's Tim in Arizona, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Legalese in the Twin Cities, Richard Banks, Fredonia, Kansas, Dixie Strong in Bama, Poet Fisherman, Haji in Michigan, Dave Simmons, Rivco Fireman, Gordo Fabulous, that's a great screen name over on YouTube, Gun Eye in Missouri, Lawrence Smith, Lisa Cole, who's a big fan of my buddy Dave Smith, Killer Vic in Missouri, and everyone else. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. Let's get right to this. I will try to look through the comments and questions a little bit later on in the episode or later on today. I'll also hi to Stephen in Missouri, Hare Medell in Tennessee. Lots of Missouri people in the house today. That's awesome. You guys are doing great work there, advancing liberty. Let's talk about this. First of all, I guess we should start out with what I was saying. What makes for a good Second Amendment sanctuary? And I think if we're just talking about the results, what's most important for us to focus on is after you pass a Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance or resolution or law or whatever you want to call it on a local or a state level, over time, the result absolutely has to be there's less gun control enforcement. We need to have less enforcement. That's the big problem, is that the governments are doing enforcement of stuff they shouldn't be doing. So, for example, if it's dealing with federal gun control, and you'll notice how I'm making a line in the sand between federal and state, because we're going to talk about that in a moment. If it's federal gun control, we want to see less state and local enforcement of the federal gun control. Or if it's dealing with state gun control, we want to see less local enforcement of the state gun control. Now, this doesn't mean going to the courts and getting the courts to turn them over. That's a totally different strategy. When we're talking about creating these ordinances, this is about really doing this thing without getting approval from the courts or having the courts telling one jurisdiction to stop doing stuff. And then, of course, what's important is when you end this type of enforcement, the big picture is if people just continue to comply in general, if the general public continues to comply, none of this really matters because there's nothing to enforce anyway. So you do need a large part of the population willing to exercise their rights, whether one tier of the government wants them to or not. And then finally, on top of it, if there is a legal challenge, and that's what we're going to get to here in a moment, if there is a legal challenge, it has to be crafted well enough. Well, it's going to survive it. It's going to get through that legal challenge, or at very least, if you try to be a little bit more aggressive on parts of it, we see this happening, for example, in Missouri, that at least some of it can survive. And I think most or all of the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act is going to make it, but the jury, I guess, is still out. So the key is ending gun control enforcement, whether it's state or local versus federal or local versus state. And then the people have to take a stand and start learning how to exercise their rights without government permission at every level. And then if there's a legal challenge, it has to be able to get through that legal challenge in whole or in part. And that brings me to the bad news, which came just a little over a week ago, almost 2 weeks ago, in Yamhill County, Oregon. And here from the News Register, presiding Judge Ladd Wiles made short work of the county's arguments in defense of its gun sanctuary ordinance on Friday. This was published July 8th, stating that the ordinance clearly defies multiple state laws. Multiple state laws. Remember that. Quote, the ordinance is declared void in its entirety. Void in its entirety. So it went to court, and and it just got totally smoked. And it's important to note, based on what they passed, if they appeal this, they are absolutely 100%, 1,000% going to lose on appeal. And it's just going to be a waste of time and money. And so whatever it is that they passed is a poorly crafted Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance because it wasn't able to survive a court challenge. And it shouldn't be surprising at all when we look at what they passed. Here's Ordinance 913, which actually starts out pretty good in Section 1. There's a bunch of whereas clauses making some statements, some of them which I think are good, some of them which I don't. But the actual ordinance, the prohibition, starts out really strong. It has that section where it says we're going to stop enforcing stuff. And then it gets a little convoluted and problematic. But it starts out with no agent, employee, or official of Yamhill County, a political subdivision of the state of Oregon, while acting in their official capacity, shall participate, and I'm paraphrasing, participate in the enforcement or use assets to or funds to aid in the enforcement of, and here's where they cause the problem, all local, state, and federal acts, laws, rules, or regulations originating from jurisdictions outside of Yamhill County, which restrict or affect an individual person's general right to keep and bear arms, including firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition. And they give them a name, extraterritorial acts, and they say these extraterritorial acts are specifically, they copied from us. Some of it they copied from us, but then they tried to go a little bit broader. I'll get to this in a moment. Specifically rejected by this county shall not be enforced by Yamhill County agents, employees, or officers, and shall be treated as if they are null, void, and of no effect in Yamhill County, Oregon, or Yamhill, however you pronounce it. I apologize if I get it wrong to anyone who lives there. Now, it sounds great in theory. The principles behind this are actually very strong. Null and void, we're not going to participate in enforcement. But it also does show a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategy, and it's also a fundamental misunderstanding of the structure of the federal and state constitutions and the strategies needed to defeat various government programs. So the big error they made here, and I'm going to explain this as I go through. Hopefully it makes sense. This is a little wonky, a little techy, but a little technical, but hopefully it makes sense. The big problem is, rather than trying to deal with state gun control on its own and federal gun control on its own in either separate sections of the law, so if one part is struck down, the rest can remain with a severability clause. They put it all together in one. That's a huge, huge mistake. Section 2.01, all local, state, and federal acts, laws, rules, regulations. We never have had that in our model legislation. When I've talked to the people pushing these in Oregon, I've recommended that they keep this separate. The reason is if it goes to court and then the state courts think that you can't do this on the state level, then the whole thing gets thrown out and you end up with nothing. But first of all, an explanation of the structure between state and federal constitutions from one of the greatest legal minds of the founding at the time of ratification, James Wilson, who also was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court, or on the Supreme Court. He was nominated by George Washington. Here he is in his State House Yard speech of October 6, 1787. This was one of the most influential Federalist explanations of the structure of the Constitution, far more influential during ratification, throughout the ratification debates, than the Federalist Papers, which we give an outsized amount of influence today. Anyways, here's Wilson. The leading discrimination between the state constitutions and the Constitution of the United States. When people established the powers of legislation under their separate governments, those are the states, they invested their representatives with every right and authority, which they did not, in explicit terms, reserve. But in delegating federal powers, another criterion was necessarily introduced, and the congressional authority is to be collected not from tacit implication, but from the positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union. And he explains this in a little easier to understand language right after that. He says, hence it is evident that in the former case, that's the states, everything which is not reserved is given, but in the latter, the reverse of the proposition prevails, and everything which is not given is reserved. So in short, the Constitution of the United States, or the Constitution for the United States, creates a federal system, a union of independent sovereign states where powers are delegated to a general government. The states are totally opposite. We may not like that, but to the founding generation, it's totally opposite. And counties are not independent sovereign entities. Even under home rule states, they are not independent sovereign states within the state delegating power to a state capital. In fact, it's the other way around. Localities, counties, towns, cities are political subdivisions of states. They're created by the state, and the state can actually shut them down if they want. I actually covered this difference between state and federal constitutions in an episode a couple of years ago that I encourage you to check out. And of course, I should mention that all the stuff that I'm mentioning in this episode, you'll find I publish a blog post for every episode with a show links section to have everything in there that I've cited, so you can read and learn in context more on your own time. It's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So first of all, it's important to understand that the structure of the state and federal constitutions are different. So if you try to use the same strategy to deal with violations of your natural right to self-defense, your natural right to keep and bear arms, you may have to use a different strategy for the state gun control than you do with the federal gun control. One may be more difficult, one may be less difficult. I know which ones those are, but maybe we'll cover that later or in another episode. So based on this structure of the proposed federal government, James Madison in Federalist number 46 in early 1788 told us that the way to defeat federal programs without relying on the federal government to somehow magically limit its own power is for states and their political subdivision, of course, because they're parts of the states, and individuals to utilize, in Madison's terms, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. A refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. I covered James Madison's approach in an episode just last week, Stop the Feds, James Madison Style. I will link to that in the show notes if you want more details on how James Madison said stop participating with federal programs to undermine and defeat them. The short version, refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, he wasn't talking about how to beat the states. That's a different conversation. Now, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court, surprisingly, I know a lot of people are suddenly fans of them who weren't and vice versa, but the Supreme Court, they don't get it right all that often in my view. But on this, they have affirmed and reaffirmed Madison's strategy over and over and over in 5 major opinions, all the way back to 1842 with some dicta from Joseph Story, all the way up to 2018. So there's a long history of what makes up what they call the anti-commandeering doctrine. Here from Mike Meharry's article giving an overview of those 5 major cases, which of course will be linked to in the show notes. The Supreme Court has long held that states do not have to actively participate in the enforcement or effectuation of federal acts or regulatory programs. This is following James Madison. I don't think they're really actually taking, well, James Madison told us to do this, so this is probably a good idea or it's a good strategy. They're not really saying that, but they come to it from another direction. But the short version is they're basically reaffirming what Madison said. States and individuals should refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. And the anti-commandeering doctrine very clearly reminds us that the federal government does not have the power to force states to help them enforce their acts or regulatory programs. So the feds might pressure them into helping. They may try to offer them incentives. They may try to threaten to take away various funding programs or condition certain funding programs on certain actions. But that's a different thing than saying, we've passed something, you just have to do it. And in fact, Oliver Ellsworth in the Connecticut Ratifying Convention, who ended up being the 3rd Chief Justice of the United States, explained it almost the same way. He said, this Constitution does not attempt to coerce sovereign bodies, states, in their political capacity. So it's also why this position, this anti-commandeering doctrine, is the big reason why the previous federal administration lost in federal court every single time they tried to force localities to enforce federal immigration law. There is no such court case, on the other hand, from the state level or the federal level in Oregon or any other state that actually has a precedent. Now, we're not actually trying to do things only based on what the courts tell us we can do. We have to keep that in mind. That's not the case that I'm making. We do have to learn how to exercise our rights, whether the courts give us permission to or not, whether the politicians give us a permission slip or not, or they're bureaucrats. But if we're talking about one level of government trying to defeat another level of government, they are always going to defer to the courts when the courts tell them you got to do this or you got to start or stop doing something. They generally just have to follow along, and that's how they do it. We don't have anyone with backbone really that are willing to just kind of go outside that bounds yet in any large capacity at this point. So anyways, so there is no court precedent on a state or federal level, Oregon or any other state, that says counties can opt out of enforcement of state law. There's tons of precedent from 1842 to 2018 that says states and counties can opt out of enforcing federal law, whether they think it's constitutional or they just disagree with it. They don't even need a reason. They can just say, we don't want to participate. So that brings me back to Yamhill County. Ordinance number 913. Of course, I will link to it in the show notes so you can read it on your own, in full, on your own time. Now, this is an attempt to use this strategy, this anti-commandeering strategy, where Madison said states should refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union, where the Supreme Court says that the federal government can't coerce the states into participating in enforcing their programs. They're actually trying to replicate that and basically make up a version of it that uses the same strategy for the counties against the state of Oregon. Here they start with, whereas there is a right to be free from the commandeering hand of government that has been most notably recognized by the Supreme Court in the case Prince versus U.S. This is 1997, Brady Act, where the feds basically tried to force localities to help them implement that gun control scheme. And the Supreme Court held that the federal government, quote, may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. I'm not 100%. Is that the... Let me make sure. Is that the actual case? Yeah, that's Justice Scalia in 1997 on that one. So they're actually starting out with a strong position. The federal government, they're reaffirming what we should all know now, that the federal government can't require the states to participate in enforcing or implementing their acts or regulatory programs. Then they suddenly, magically, without listing any other cases, they magically try to put that federal position versus the states into a state versus counties thing at the same time. So they say, whereas Yamhill asserts its legal authority to refuse to cooperate with state and federal firearms laws that violate those rights, and to proclaim Second Amendment sanctuary for law-abiding citizens in their cities and counties. So they're saying, look, we know the Supreme Court has held that the states don't have to participate in enforcing federal acts. So therefore, our county doesn't have to participate in enforcing a state act. Now, I want to see the counties do this. It's very important for them to actually have that position and follow up on that in regards to these state gun control programs. And it's more important for individuals to be willing in large numbers to exercise their rights, whatever Oregon passes, whatever gets passed in Sacramento or in Albany, New York, or in any state. Austin, doesn't matter, wherever it comes from. But this is basically what I warned against. If you try to combine these two issues, state gun control and federal gun control, into one sanctuary ordinance, you are guaranteed to lose every single time. This is how I put it in an interview that I did with the Oregonian in 2020. Not talking about specifically Yamhill, but there's an effort in a bunch of counties to pass something very similar. Michael Bolden called it convoluted, confused, messy at best. He said he has encouraged gun rights activists to model their ordinances after immigration sanctuary laws, like the one passed in Oregon decades ago, that forbids local law enforcement from using public resources to find or detain undocumented immigrants not suspected of a crime. Now, anyone who's opposed to immigration sanctuaries, you'll not find anyone out there saying, oh, Oregon passed this law back in 1987, and it's no big deal because it does nothing. The reason that people don't like it in Oregon is because it's extremely effective in hindering the ability of the federal government to enforce its immigration laws. We don't have to like that policy, but we know it works. And the reason it works is because it is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. It's just what James Madison said. Going further, the report says Oregon's gun sanctuary measures don't just address federal gun laws. They target state ones too. It was there, I think the reporter, when I first talked to her about this, was surprised to hear this because I was very emphatically telling her, look, I want to see this all nullified. I want to see it all gone. But the strategy that they're using is problematic because they're trying to address state and federal gun laws at the same time. I will actually tell you right out front, they're quoting me here, I'm fully on board with the concept. I'm surprised they actually included this. I am with the gun rights people in concept, but I think they have crafted these so poorly that in practice they actually do nothing. And that brings us back to the draft complaint. This is the lawsuit filed against Yamhill County and Ordinance 913 by the Department of Justice. They say Ordinance 913 went into effect. You can read this in full. The entire complaint is not about the fact that they're trying to opt out of federal gun control. No one's suing them over that because there is all this precedent for 150 plus years that says this is no problem. So if they just had passed, we're not going to participate in federal gun control, there'd probably be no lawsuit. And if there was, even if they lost in an early round, they're going to end up winning in the long run because this is just how it plays out. So the entire complaint is the fact that they're trying to also say we don't have to participate in state gun control. It declares Yamhill County to be a Second Amendment sanctuary and contains 3 categories of unlawful provisions. Here they are. 1, it purports to nullify, void, and render unenforceable new state laws relating to firearms. So the issue that the lawsuit is about is addressing state laws. 2, it prohibits county officials from enforcing new state firearms laws or utilizing county resources in connection with the enforcement or investigation of those laws. Again, the second complaint is about state laws. And the third one, they want to establish a private cause of action authorizing lawsuits, which is a good strategy because it can be effective, but for enforcing state gun control laws. They say these provisions set forth in more detail below are unlawful and invalid on their face because they are preempted by or violate state law. Now, let's be clear here. I don't agree with Oregon state laws. I don't like their gun control. I don't like the gun control in any state, even the ones with the least amount of gun control, like Arizona, for example. When you look at the list, the ATF puts out these handy sheets on gun control laws in every state, and even Arizona, Texas, everywhere. They all have a bunch of gun control on the books. They just don't seem nearly as bad when you compare it to places like where I live here in Southern California or in Oregon or New York. Then if you grade on a curve, which I don't, then they seem much less bad. So I don't like the state gun control laws in Oregon or anywhere. I don't like the federal gun controls laws, and I'm not happy with the results in the court, but let's face facts. And we have to deal with facts if we want to deal with good strategy. And we want to have, as our result, less enforcement of these gun control measures. You will never find a single judge in any state in the entire country. There is not one that exists that agrees with the notion that a county can just opt out of enforcing a state law. There isn't one. It doesn't exist. And here's an example of it. And every time they pass one of these, anytime there is going to be a lawsuit, they're going to lose. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for actually passing this anyway, because if you can overwhelm the system, then that's its own strategy. But you still have to keep it separate. And I'll get to that in a moment. But because they went 2 for 1, instead of just passing one that said, we're going to opt out of enforcing federal gun control, and then made the case like, hey, look, we've had a law on the books here in Oregon since 1987 that says we don't have to enforce federal immigration law, and no one's actually trying to shut that down. Because legally, under court precedent, it's extremely sound and has a lot of precedent behind it. So if they took that approach, at least Yamhill County, now I know a lot of people don't care about federal gun control because they're okay with gun control, but there's a lot of it on the books going back to 1934. None of it should exist. 1934, the National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the bump stock ban of 2018, and all the garbage that's still on the way this year and in the future, All of it shouldn't exist. The ATF, the only thing they're authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. So if Yamhill County had taken a smart approach on this, rather than trying to do everything at once, if they would have followed my advice, at least they'd have on the books a ban of participating in the enforcement of federal gun control. Then if they really wanted to deal with state gun control, which they should, because there's a lot of bad stuff on the books in Oregon, they pass a separate ordinance trying to do this. And if you get enough counties doing this, there are a bunch of counties. One of the complaints by the supporters of this are like, hey, there's a bunch of counties that are doing this, and they're singling out Yamhill and one other county to go after us because there's only so many resources to do all these lawsuits. And this is actually one of the strategies that was used in Ohio and a number of other states in resisting the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. The few times where there were actual strong, we'll say, interference with federal agents. They were basically saying, like, look, we know we're going to lose in court if we, try to arrest a federal agent for capturing or kidnapping someone claimed to be a slave, but we're going to do it anyways. And we're going to keep doing it because they don't have enough resources to handle this. But you don't try to address them all at the same time. Again, the important thing to note is it's because they went for 2 in 1, they ended up with 0. Remember, Judge Wiles declared the ordinance void in its entirety. And the sad part about all this, the gun rights groups out there that are actually pushing for Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances or resolutions, I'll mention resolutions as well here just momentarily. The ones that are pushing this, they all use this bad approach. Every single one of them. I don't know why. I don't know if it's grandstanding. I don't know if they're trying to just boast that they've got the strongest thing out there. But the strongest thing out there is the weakest thing out there if it does nothing in the long run. And even worse than that, if you talk about resolutions that do nothing, like, for example, the 100+ that passed in Virginia a few years ago in 2019, I think the numbers are close to 2,000 of these have passed around the country. And if you have these non-binding resolutions where they're claiming to create a Second Amendment sanctuary, but it's a non-binding resolution that bans the enforcement of nothing, and you get tens of thousands of people to rally in support of them, and then you tell them, oh yeah, you know that sanctuary that we created? Well, it didn't really do anything. Now we actually need to create a new version of that. What's going to happen is you deflate the momentum. You ruin the energy that's in support, and in the long run, you get less and less people in support, and the likelihood of actually getting something good passed goes to 0. And this is what we've seen happen in a bunch of states, whether it's Florida or Tennessee or Pennsylvania or Virginia and Texas and elsewhere, over and over and over. This has been the approach. So that's the problem with resolutions. Resolutions, non-binding, can be very good strategy. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison used resolutions for nullification and interposition against the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's an important first step. But if you sell it as something that's more than what it is, then people are tricked. And then when you say, okay, now we need to come back, instead of saying right off the bat, this is a non-binding resolution, but we're getting the ball rolling, we're going to have to do some follow-up later on, then they know what to expect. But if you claim it is something that it isn't, and then you go back and say, well, no, we made a mistake. Sorry, we lied, because that's really what it is. We lied. It didn't do what we told you. It didn't create a sanctuary. Now we really need to create a sanctuary. You're going to lose a lot of people. And I don't know. I think in some areas it is actually intentional to try to damage the efforts that we've been pushing for so long. And in other areas, it's just pure ignorance. So the short version is, don't try to combine these all together. I've got 5 points for what's the fix on this. So let's start out, 1, with the fundamental principle that all gun control, all of it, state, federal, whatever, it is a violation of our natural right to self-defense. What the founding generation considered the first law of nature, our right to keep and bear arms, however we decide to exercise our right to self-defense is the first law of nature. So let's start out with that. Number 2, government courts on a state and federal level, they almost entirely 100% disagree with us. So if you believe in the natural right to keep and bear arms, the courts are not on your side. Well, they may move things in the right direction once in a while. But 3, we actually want to stop and nullify all gun control, state and federal, so good strategy is important. 4, the nature and structure of the federal and state constitutions are completely opposite. So the strategy to deal with them has to be different. If you try to do the same thing all together in one, you're guaranteed to fail. And that's the most important point here if you are doing this kind of activism is number 5. Don't ever, ever, ever try to pass a local ordinance, a local law, to defeat both state and federal gun control using a strategy designed to defeat federal programs in the same ordinance. If you put them together, you are doomed. As soon as they try to take you to court, you are going to lose every time. And what's going to happen is going to be very similar to what just happened in Yamhill County this month. They'll strike down the entire thing. They'll say the whole thing is actually unconstitutional and void. Now, there are some strategies if you have to actually address it all at once, if you just have to, and you're stubborn about it. What you at least need to do is put the sections on state gun control and federal gun control in clearly marked, clearly defined, separate sections. And you also need to include what's called a severability clause at the end that basically says if a court finds any part of this to be unconstitutional, the rest of it stands. Now, that's no guarantee that that's how it will play out. The courts don't always follow severability clauses passed in local ordinances, but it'll at least improve your chances. But the best approach is just ban local or state law enforcement from participating in federal gun control, whether new, old, current, whatever, however you decide to craft that, whatever the best strategy is for your area, start with that. That's one ordinance, that's one law. And then the second one, do the same on the state. And if you want to prove that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, do it. I want to see it happen. But I also expect to happen is that they're all going to get struck down. But on the other hand, if there's enough people doing this, if there's enough localities doing this to the states, it's going to be very difficult for them to pull that off. Anyways, I know this is a little technical. This is not awesome news. I hope this is helpful, educational, interesting, all that stuff. Let me take a look over in the comments and questions and see if there's anything that I can get back to you. Gun control is prima facie unconstitutional, says Kirk Morrison. I think it's a violation of our natural rights rather than focusing on the Constitution alone. But yes, I agree with the fact that all gun control should be ended, all of it, state and federal. But again, that point that I made, I think it was number 2. The government courts on both the state and federal level 100% disagree with us. So if we're passing legislation that is likely to end up in court, we have to keep in mind what the courts are going to say. And if we're passing legislation where local law enforcement is going to follow what the courts tell them to do, then we have to think about what the courts are going to say. So if we know we can opt out of federal gun control and not have a problem in the courts, why don't we just do that? And then if we know we're going to have a problem with trying to opt out of state gun control, why don't we do that separately? That would be much better strategy. Unfortunately, they all get it convoluted by trying to combine everything as Second Amendment rights, and it's a nationalism approach, and it's really, well, whatever. Let me take a look a little further. So I agree with that, Kirk. I appreciate that feedback. I agree that we have to get rid of all gun control. Here's Fuzz T. Fork. This is a great one. We saw the tyranny beginning in 1934. But our forefathers thought it wasn't too bad. They should have stopped it then. Absolutely. And that reminds me of the great quote from Mercy Otis Warren, resist the first approaches of tyranny, or James Otis Jr., who said, if we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late. Compliance, as John Dickinson told us, establishes the detestable precedent. So once they passed that in 1934, the National Firearms Act, which shouldn't have existed, the fact that there wasn't widespread non-compliance and nullification efforts means it established a precedent for 1968 and 86 and 88 and 2018 and 2022 and the rest. See a little bit further. Cowboy Roy Rogers also always remember that our written constitutional rights are our God-given birthright and human rights. I just like referring to them as natural rights rather than constitutional rights. We are born free with the right to live. And of course, as Samuel Adams put it in 1772, our right to liberty, our right to property, and the means to defend them in whatever manner we decide. Bonehead says, I hate taxes. That's a nice side note. We, the people learning how to exercise our rights, remain teachable, says Lisa. I appreciate that feedback. I'll read through a few more of these a little bit later on and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to, whether if I'm able to have time to reply to them in the comment section. But that does help trigger the algorithm. So please continue leaving comments. I do read through them all. I haven't been able to reply to many lately. You can also email me some feedback over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Of course, if you support the show, you support the work we're doing to nullify all gun control, all of it, all the time. It's a lot of work, but as Thomas Paine put it, if we are to expect to reap the blessings of freedom, we must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. So let's go with that approach. It's going to be a lot of work. We're not going to get from despotism, as Thomas Jefferson put it, to liberty in a feather bed, but let's get rolling, because if we wait for the government to limit itself, we might wait 50 or 100 or 150 years. Many of us will be dead at that point. We want to set a foundation for liberty, whether the government gives us permission to or not. And that's the message we try to bring to more people every day. You can help us do that. Nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It starts out at just $2 a month, and I couldn't be more grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's not good news, but I hope you learned something. It's very important we get this right, and hopefully I made the case as to why getting it wrong does damage. The short version one more time, and we see this happening in Virginia, for example. You had tens of thousands of people rallying in support of Second Amendment sanctuaries, and none of those sanctuaries created a sanctuary for anything. I'm challenging people to tell me how those sanctuary resolutions, non-binding, have ended any gun control in Virginia. They may have done an election strategy, and I think that's primarily what it was an election or a fundraising strategy or a lobbying strategy, but it wasn't an effort to nullify anything. It was a false claim that they were creating these sanctuaries. They created a sanctuary for nothing, and now we need to go back and try to do it again. But we lost all that energy that was out there. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean we're not going to get it back, but certainly it's going to be more difficult. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully a lot of this was clear. If not, feel free to ask some questions, and I will try my best to either do a follow-up episode or answer them by email or in the comments. Again, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on Friday here on the path to liberty.